Kia ora, g'day and welcome to the history of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Episode 79, Scarfie Flats with Sarah Gallagher. This podcast is supported by our amazing patrons. If you want to support Hans, go to patreon.com/historyaotearoa. This episode, we are taking a quick break from Māori games to cover something a bit more recent and a bit more obscure in New Zealand's social history. Sarah Gallagher has spent a good number of years researching the phenomena of university students naming flats in Dunedin. For those of you outside New Zealand, to translate, I'm talking about University of Otago students naming the houses they live in, what we call flats. Being a former student of Otago myself, known as a Scarfie on account of how cold it is in Dunners, this was something that was very normal to me during my time in Dunedin. Every day I would walk past flats like How Bazaar, a flat on Howe Street, Pussy Planet, an all-girls flat, and the Country Club, spelt without the O. So when I found Sarah's book, called Scarfie Flats of Dunedin, I was absolutely enthralled, and as you will hear in the coming episode, I adored it. Naturally, I asked if Sarah would like to come on to Hans and share some of the stories and insights from this fantastic book, all about Scarfie Flats and Dunedin student culture. Before we start though, just a little warning. In this episode, there is some rude language, including some discussion of sexual themes, on account of some flats having rather colourful names, and we do lightly touch on those in relation to sexual assault. So if those things aren't your cup of tea, maybe give this one a miss, and definitely don't listen to this one with the kids. For everyone else, I hope you enjoy and learn something new. Cool. Oh, well, first thing, obviously, thank you very much for coming on to chat with me about what I think is actually my favourite book in my collection of books that I have accumulated over my time doing this podcast for about 3 years now.
Wow.
Yeah, I chewed through it. I read it in like 2 weeks or something, I think.
Yeah.
I loved it.
Oh, thank you.
Admittedly, I'm slightly biased because I am right in that intersection of like the exact demographic of people you were probably trying to target.
Yeah.
Being a history nerd and having gone to University of Otago myself and lived in flats and seen a lot of the flats that were in that book.
Yeah.
So for me, it was a big like, oh, this is right. Like, this is right on my very niche interests.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah.
So thank you very much for coming on to chat about it and that sort of thing. So I guess to start with, can you tell us a bit about yourself and kind of how you became interested in the history of Dunedin and student flats in particular?
Yep, for sure. Okay. I grew up in Christchurch. I came down to Dunedin to go to Teachers College and university. And I never went into a hall, and I'm the first in my family to go to university, so this whole thing was so new to me. I had no idea. None of my family could advise me. So I went into a flat with a friend of mine, ended up doing Teachers College for a couple of years, dropped out, finished my degree, ended up doing a master's in classics, and then got a job at the university library and started doing a master's in library and information studies. And it was during that I sort of came across ephemera as a print culture item. And we had this assignment where we needed to basically do an exhibition that taught the public about ephemera. And I realised, I had this epiphany one day, that I was living in this really interesting landscape where there were these excellent examples of print culture, which were this named flats that students create. And so, we did this. It was a joint exhibition, a joint project with two of my student colleagues. But I did the on the ground field work and collected all the names and everything. And and it just continued. And anyway, in terms of my career, I ended up being an academic librarian, and I worked in the information industry, in various different fields, tertiary, public sector, overseas, here in New Zealand, for about 20 years. And I'm currently a heritage advisor based here in Dunedin at the moment, so I don't work for the university anymore. But obviously, this project has been an ongoing passion and interest for, just over 20 years now.
Nice.
Yeah.
Cool. So it's definitely a long term.
Definitely. I call it, it's a longitudinal study.
Yeah. There's not many of those around. So
No, and they generally have a lot of funding and a lot of staff, and they're very rigorous. And mine's very amateur. Yeah.
Yeah, as someone also doing an amateur history project, basically do it all on his own, I definitely understand where you're coming from. So, absolutely. So in terms of kind of, I guess, student flats in particular, do you want to tell us a bit about, I guess we could call the stereotype of the Dunedin flat? Because I guess it is very similar in a lot of universities, but Dunedin is very well known for its, style of flats, and it has a particular reputation for its flats. So do you want to tell us a bit about kind of that?
Yeah. Well, I think what Dunedin has, which is really unique in New Zealand at least, is that we have a residential campus. So that means, you've got the university, and then the area surrounding that is basically a residential area that a lot of students live in. And it didn't always used to be that way. It's developed over time, and it's certainly become more intensified as a residential area for students as people began to earn more money and they looked to buy property as investments, and then they would rent those out to students. And, back in the, 80s, 90s, there was a boom in population at the university, and so more people were needing places to stay. So this all kind of happened at a similar time. I mean, when I was a student in 1991, living in Mouse House on Cumberland Street, there were still families and elderly people living on Castle Street, along with all the students. Not so much anymore. And, it's really easy to see that when you look at Statistics New Zealand data, what the demographic of students are. It's like 98% living in those area units. Yeah. So, and I still distinctly remember how blown away I was walking around and just seeing people my own age, in this small area. That was all you would see. Yeah. So I think that is getting back to your original question, that is sort of the defining difference between Dunedin as a place to flat compared with other parts of the country. It's a big area, and within it also, it used to be, I don't know if it still holds this record, but it was the largest concentration of Edwardian and Victorian houses in the country. And so you have a specific feel, a character, a streetscape, a vibe,
definitely.
And that's what, people want to have that experience of living in this type of housing. So back in the day, of course, prior to the new housing regs, there was kind of, you could expect to live in an environment that was maybe different to what you lived at home. Most people would, be living in a place that was fairly warm, probably, reasonably well decorated. Some of these old places weren't. And I mean, despite even in the 90s when, the flat that I lived in, there were holes in the floor covered up with vinyl. But, I was in contact with people that were flatting there in the 1970s, and there were holes in the floor that were just massive holes in the floor that they had to navigate around. So I don't think that there are probably terribly many people that are in that situation now, but the general impression of people around the country has for a long time been that if you go to Dunedin, you're going to be living in a cold, shitty flat.
Yeah.
A character flat,
A character, exactly. Character as in the flat's got character, and it'll give you some character as well, I think.
Yeah, that's right. A character building experience.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, and that was one of the things I was quite interesting for me was reading the ones on, yeah, you talk about like the 1970s and that sort of stuff, and it was kind of the same vibe. Like that's what 50-ish years ago now, and that was the same vibe as when I went to uni 7-ish years ago,
right?
And I was like,
yeah,
it's just kind of never changed.
yeah, and there's always going to be landlords that I guess may be able to wriggle their way around some of the regs. Hopefully that's changing. I mean, nobody wants to be living in an unhealthy home. You still want to have a good experience. Yeah,
it's definitely that. I should preface this by saying I don't want people to live in unhealthy homes as well. But there is this kind of, I don't know, just kind of like this. I guess for me, it's kind of like, on the one hand, absolutely, we should be improving the housing stock of New Zealand in general. Because it's pretty shocking, in general. But also, like, that was kind of a kind of a part of the experience of, at least when I went to Dunedin, was living in my flat in general was actually fine. It was just really cold.
Yeah.
So that kind of thing was, I don't know, it was kind of part of the experience. And although, again, on the one hand, don't think people should really have to experience that, but on the other hand, that is a fairly fond memory. For me, at least, having arguments over whether to turn the heat pump on and that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Well, at least you had a heat pump.
That's true. Yeah, I did have a heat pump.
Yeah. I mean, things like clear drains. I'm just going to put in a little plug here for actually managing buildings. Clear drains, clean gutters, good roofs, insulation. All of that kind of stuff is actually going to help you maintain your building, and that's something we really want people to do too. Is to the greenest building is one that is repaired and restored, not knocked down and concrete tilt slab put up. You don't have to provide a good environment by knocking down a house with good bones.
Yeah, absolutely. So can you explain a bit, I guess, about the concept of kind of naming flats? Because I don't actually know if it's, at least from people that I know who went to like Vic or Auckland, it's not really a thing there from what I understand. So can you tell us a bit about kind of what it actually is and the whole kind of thing around it?
Yeah. So these are theories. Okay, these are my theories. So something that we've noticed here in New Zealand is, part of the work that I do, and also through researching these flats, was that when the settlers first came out here and people started building houses, they would give them names. Back in history as well, places tended to be named or have hanging signs to identify them in villages. It wasn't until, I think, was it the 1600s or something, maybe in the UK, where street numbers came in. And so, I don't know if you probably never read Millie Molly Mandy as a child.
I'm afraid I haven't. No.
It's one of these fabulous books that's got a map in it at the front. And, Millie Molly Mandy's house was the little white cottage with a thatched roof. So, we build up a language to find our way around our communities, and people would name their houses, or you'd get to know that that's the the little white cottage with a thatched roof or whatever. But when settlers came over to New Zealand, there are a couple of main ways in which they would name their houses. They would name their house after the place they came from, or they would adopt a suitable Māori name.
Yep.
And there's actually a list of suitable Māori names that I've come across in Hocken Archives, which describes, different kinds of houses or views from that house. For example, there's a place called Manono. If you look on the heritage list, you'll see quite a few. So that's really interesting. So there is an impression that houses with names have a certain cachet about them.
Sorry, I was just looking briefly. I've got a Spates book next to me here because I've been researching Spates recently, and that was something that came up quite a bit. Was the founders of Spates all had named houses,
right?
And the most recent one I read was Charles Spates's house, which was Aotearoa. That was the name of his house. So again, I guess that was a an appropriate Māori name.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure what that translates as, but yes, yeah. Often it will, maybe refer to the view. Yeah, so the cachet of having a name makes it sound fancy, but also I think we have a tendency to name things that we really care about. And I don't know if you ever named your bike or your first car or your first computer disk. I named my first computer disk.
Yeah, my computer that this is running on is named. All my cars have been named.
Yeah. Okay, so you get what I mean. And for students leaving home for the first time, having their very first home, while they don't own that home, they're making it their home.
Yeah.
And particularly in Dunedin, we're going back to this idea of this residential university where you've got this village, if you like. If you think of the university as the castle, and all of the villagers are living around it in their little houses. There's this community of people that are naming places, and so because the generation of a student is basically about 3 years, usually 3 to 4 years, got quite a high turnover of people coming through, seeing some flats being named. And we've certainly noticed that there are streets, and it has changed a little bit over time, but once you get a couple of named places on a street, others will pop up as well.
Interesting.
Yeah, so Howe Street, Clyde Street, there used to be a whole row of named houses. Howe Street's got quite a few now. Leith Street, Hyde Street, obviously.
Yeah, famous one.
Yeah.
No, that's interesting. I guess everyone wants to get in on the action. I guess once one crops up, everyone kind of gets maybe the same sort of idea, like, maybe we should join up, and I guess bouncing ideas off. Yeah, the neighbours and that sort of thing is probably what ends up happening.
Yeah, well, I mean, in my experience of being a student, that was certain. I remember us, discussing it as a flat and saying, "Oh, we should name our flat." And sometimes it worked, and sometimes it didn't. Sometimes you just couldn't actually come up with something everyone, I don't know, didn't really stick.
Yeah, I guess some are catchier, have a bit more of a more compelling theme, maybe.
Yeah,
that kind of stuff.
That's right. It might depend on the group of people. And I know that there are plenty. I mean, I've only collected names that I've found evidence for, where people have told me about them, or I've seen them, or I've seen them recorded somewhere else. But I know that there's a big collection of names out there that there was never any, people didn't actually create a sign, or they had a sign that was kept inside the flat.
Yeah, and then I guess there's also that, that sort of collection of like names that just specific groups of people would give a flat. They just use to reference, it's that brick flat on the corner that's always got the smokers outside of it or whatever. And that kind of thing, like people just referencing flats. Kind of in that way as well, and the names kind of developing from that, just in specific friend groups, and that sort of thing. So there's probably a lot of names out there that are just used by a very specific group of people to reference particular buildings, and they just never get further than that because it's only specific to them as well.
They probably haven't made it into my database.
Yeah. So I guess the next question is, do we kind of know when this tradition of flatting started? Because there was a point where people didn't tend to flat with people who were not related, or live with people who weren't related to them. And then I guess at some point there was. Yeah. So do we know kind of when that point was?
Yeah, well, from what I've discovered so far, it was the 1930s. So, I mean, you and I have both grown up in a time that's, fairly equal in terms of how we live and who we can live with, and that there aren't these sort of strictures of society that we're around, even when my parents, who aren't actually that old, they're like, my mum isn't even 70 yet, that they grew up with, where like it wouldn't have been acceptable for my mum and dad to live together until they were married, and they didn't. So and they got married in 1971. So back in the 30s, remember there was a depression on between the two big wars, and there was an influx of people going into training, as is what usually happens when there's a recession or people are losing jobs because people want to retrain. And at the time, there were only 4 halls of residence at the university, and it cost a bit to stay in the halls, as it does today.
It does still cost quite a lot.
Some things haven't changed. Flatting wasn't a thing then. The other places that you could stay if you couldn't stay at home were boarding houses. So typically it would be a big house. The owner would be there and they would rent out rooms.
So it's kind of like flatting, but
kind of like flatting, almost more like studio flats, I guess.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. And I haven't kind of gone down that route too far in terms of investigating, what life was like there, whether you would, there might be 2 of you in a room or whether it was just a single room situation. But from what I have read, and this is largely from student magazines, so bearing this with a pinch of salt, landladies could be quite bossy, expect you home at a certain time, so your life wasn't really maybe as free as young people their age would have liked.
Yeah, but it was still quite, I guess, not as independent, I guess, as what you'd say flatting is kind of nowadays.
Yeah, totally. So the Batch, which was the first flat that I've come across that has been documented, it still exists as a building. It's still a student flat. It's on Leith Street. So the south end past the university, and that was deliberately set up as a flat by a group of students who are largely divinity students. So for those that aren't familiar with that term, that's students that are studying theology, but particularly to go into practice as a minister, as a Presbyterian minister. So Knox College, which most people will know of as a hall of residence now, was a school of theology, and that was one of the 4 halls of residence, but it was also where the divinity students studied. And so these div students set up the Batch, and there were up to, I think sometimes there were maybe up to 10 of them. There was a waiting list to get in there, and I managed to get in touch with one of the original residents a couple of years before he died.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, amazing. And he sent me a piece of their letterhead. So this is, it's like monogrammed paper for writing letters on. They had their own motto, and they had their own special crest as well. Yeah.
So what was the motto? Because I thought it was quite funny.
Yeah. Well, it was in Greek because they're divinity students. So, they had to be able to read the Bible in various languages, ancient, Greek and Latin. And it was because of poverty. That was what it translated as. And their crest had like an open book and a broom and a fry pan and a rolling pin on it.
Yeah, which I thought was very, I don't know, it felt very right that probably the first proper flat in Dunedin had the motto of because of poverty.
Yeah.
That seemed to me like that's very appropriate,
Yeah. But I mean, I find it really touching as well. I mean, it's funny, but it's also really touching because it's like, and of course these Christian students, were coming under fire from other students at university. I'm not talking about these students from that flat, but just, Christian students as a whole, as being quite conservative, but actually they're really quite progressive. They found a solution to come together and work together to rent a flat, run a household in order that they could meet their goals, which was to become educated. Yeah. And I mean, it shows a huge, social conscience, which is a tenet of the religion. But yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, really cool. And, they created a community, they created a family, and they had all of these accoutrements as well, as well as having a letterhead. They had their own mortar for graduations. They had a visitor's book and a photograph album and prayers at night. And
that was the one that got me, that I thought was very funny. You mentioned in the book that they had a list of, like jobs that everyone have to do. And I was like, I've lived in a flat where you have like a spinner or something, or you have you make a little fancy thing and put names beside of who's doing what every week.
Yeah.
And I went, you list out, they had the rubbish and the cooking. I was like, yeah, it makes sense. Yeah. Also prayers in the evening. And I was like, that's pretty funny. Yeah. That didn't happen in any of my flats.
I'm sure it happens in some flats, but yeah. I imagine the majority of flats probably don't.
Yeah, I just thought that was kind of an interesting one to me.
Did you have a housekeeper though?
I did not. No. Not for $90 a week. I didn't. Hell no.
Gosh, $90. That's pretty cheap, isn't it?
That's what I thought. My flat that I stayed in for the majority of my time at uni was $110 a week. So I was very close to the uni. So when again reading the book and it said $90 a week and you get a housekeeper, I was like, shit, that's cheap.
Yeah, I reckon.
Especially comparing it to one of my other mates had a $90 a week flat, and it was, my God, it is one of the worst flats I have ever seen. The windowsills were like rotting because they were soaked, and it just smelled like mold the whole time. And I was
so bad.
A true Dunedin flat, that one, for $20 less than what I was paying, which was quite a drastic change.
That's shocking. Yeah.
But yeah, so that was a really interesting one to me, was how much that they were paying per week and got a housekeeper, which was a pretty good deal.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we did kind of, or you did kind of mention that 98% of the student population lives kind of within that North Dunedin area, which kind of, I guess, as a byproduct means that most of the named flats are in that area as well. Do we see any notable named flats kind of outside that kind of North Dunedin-ish area?
Oh, right. Yeah, so I was thinking about this, and now that 98%, I'll just clarify that. So that is about 98% of the people living in that area of sort of fit within the student demographic.
I see.
Yes. Yep. So not 98% of enrolled students.
Live there.
Yeah. No, it's just so I've looked at the age ranges of people that live in the main flatting area where the named flats show up. Have you looked at my flats map? Because that kind of gives you a good idea.
It's been a while, if I'm honest.
Well, it doesn't really change. It just gets denser. It doesn't tend to spread out that much. But in terms of like the immediate North Dunedin area, there are a few. There are none hugely notable. I mean, the main one that I was going to mention really was the Shit Show Chateau, which probably will fall outside the sort of Stats New Zealand area unit of North Dunedin. Yeah. And, there's a story about that in the book, as you've mentioned.
Yeah. Well, since we're on that, one of my questions kind of did revolve around kind of the Shit Show Chateau, because it is a interesting story of a student-led venture to actually improve a flat, which is unusual and doesn't happen very often. So I guess, do you want to tell a bit about kind of that story and kind of what other efforts have been made to improve flats in Dunedin? Yeah,
well, this one was interesting. They were looking at starting up a Rate Your Flat online system where students could rate their flat, and then that would help other students in the following years find a decent flat, a flat that wasn't completely crappy. They deliberately went out to try and find the worst flat in Dunedin and negotiate a deal with the landlord to be supplied with materials, but to do the work themselves, to do the flat up and make it more habitable and, healthier and safer to live in. So it was I think the main student who was involved, I think she was a science communications student. So this was it was a really awesome project, actually. It was very, very cool. They did encounter quite a few problems. The house was not in good shape. And but they had good media around it. They raised a lot of awareness around it, and it sort of it really highlighted the situation that some students live in, and it highlighted the really bad state of some houses in the rental market.
Yeah, definitely. It's yeah, as I said, I've seen some pretty crap ones.
Yeah.
When I was there.
Have you ever seen a loo that bad though?
No, admittedly,
Yeah.
I have not. I did see a knife and a butter knife sitting on the floor of a toilet of a flat that I did look at once, which was, we were all a bit weirded out why that was there and not picked up. But yeah, not quite as bad as that one that is shown in the book. That was shocking, to say the least.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, that was a yeah, I thought that was quite an interesting story, because I guess not a lot of students would have that kind of motivation to improve their flat.
Yeah, that's right. Yes. Yeah. I think they were part of the Carbon Zero movement as well.
Yeah, you did mention that they were part of that as well, yeah.
Yeah, so there was sort of, environmental motivations as well as, environmental motivations as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, as you say, a house that actually is insulated properly and that sort of thing, uses the shower and that kind of stuff. So there was that kind of, that sort of thing going on as well. So kind of in the same vein, there's a lot of really, really great small stories that I found in the book of just student life in general. Just that have a lot of humor, a lot of Kiwi ingenuity, even, and sometimes just like really gross stuff like the shit show chateau. And a lot of that is spurred on because of that, again, because students tend to live a fairly frugal lifestyle, if you want to put it diplomatically. Is there any sort of story that is your favorite or really sticks out to you in particular?
There's a couple from Scribes, which I don't know, do you remember Scribes Bookshop?
I do remember Scribes Bookshop. I was very sad to hear that it closed down.
Well, it's not only closed down, it's now gone.
The whole building?
Yeah. Yes. So that is sad. It lives on in this book, however. And it was a notorious flat for quite some time. And there's lots of, small, delicious stories that have come.
That was, sorry, just to clarify, that was the miners' flat.
That was right? The miners' flat, yes. Yep. So the university had a world-class school of mines. So mining studies was one of the early subjects taught at the University of Otago. And we exported students all around the world and gained a really great reputation for our mining students. And anyway, there was one particular student who he brought back some explosives wire from he'd been working up in Nelson, I think, over the summer holidays, and brought back some explosives wire with him and used it to hang his curtains. And these were the same students who, used to get their girlfriends who were resident at St Margaret's College to smuggle their sheets and to get washed by the hall, and all of these kinds of things. Trying to keep people out of their parties by putting Vaseline over the guttering so that people couldn't climb up drain pipes, and having the police come and knock on the door and join them for beers, and growing massive fungus out of their bathroom, all over the landing at the top of the stairs. So things like that, they're amusing. You probably wouldn't want to live that way though.
No, not. There was an interesting bit in the book though where I can't quite remember who wrote it, but they were saying how it was. I think it was the stuff on Hyde Street. Even was all about kind of. It was something everyone understood. It was something that you did for 2 years. That you lived in absolute squalor. You wrecked the place. You probably took a few years off your life as well. But you went and did it for a couple of years to kind of. This is the thing we do, and then we'll become normal people and productive members of society after that.
That was Joel McManus, and he's now a reporter for Stuff. Yes. So there you go. You see, he did manage to come out the other side, largely unscathed.
Yeah, exactly.
Go Joel. Yeah.
But it was that kind of that endearing kind of attitude that it's like, we'll go do some dumb stuff. while we're kind of 20 years old, and then after that we'll go and be bored
Yeah.
and get a job. And
Yeah. It's that memory making stuff, isn't it? Yeah.
yeah, and that was that particular flat, that miner's flat, struck me quite a lot as well, because there's a line in there from one of the previous tenants where he talks about how he remembers all these things about in the flat, all these things that he did, but he doesn't remember the last time he descended the stairs and got into the taxi that would take him to the airport to go wherever he'd gotten his job. And that kind of resonated with me a little bit, because I was like, yeah, I don't remember the last time I left my flat either. And I don't know, that just it was kind of poignant.
Yeah, definitely.
To me a bit.
It's a very special time.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's something I've noticed too through this research is, talking with students that are living in their flats in Dunedin at the time, they often don't have a lot to say about why they've named their flat and what it means to them. But later, with the benefit of some years under your belt and a bit more experience and time and space, you look back and it's then that all of that stuff starts to have meaning and makes you realise how much it had an impact on building you as the person that you are.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the phrases I've heard in the past is kind of type 2 fun, which is, it's not necessarily fun at the time, but when you look back on it, it's very fun. Which I think is kind of fits this quite a lot. There are obviously aspects of being a student that are very fun at the time, but there's a lot that are not very fun at all, like living in a very cold flat, for example. But you look back on it, a few years, even if just like 1 or 2 years later, and you go, yeah, no, that was actually pretty right. Like,
do you think that's sort of synonymous with character building?
I get, that kind of thing as well. Yeah, that, kind of makes you who you are, builds your character, that kind of thing as well. Yeah, absolutely. Going into more, I guess, the actual what the research involved for this. How did you actually manage to find all these people? because as I was reading the book, I'm going, oh, there's, you've managed to get in contact with previous tenants, which I'm sure did not leave their phone number on the wall for you to find. So I guess, and some of these are decades old. Some of these people, they flatted in those flats, 40, 50 years ago. So how was that experience? How did you manage to find them?
Yeah, well, it was largely pure luck and serendipity and Facebook. But prior to Facebook, so this is how it all kind of became a thing, actually, Thomas. It was, we'd done the project. I kept collecting things. I kept taking photos whenever I came back to Dunedin. And then when Facebook, actually, first of all, it was Flickr. Flickr became a thing. And I thought, I'm going to put my collection of photos up on Flickr because, I've always taken loads of photos, and my husband and I had been overseas, and we'd posted photos up there so friends and family could see them. And so I created a Dunedin Flat Names group and posted my photos in there, and people started connecting with them. Yeah. And sometimes it was people that had lived in those flats, like DSIR. I think there's a story about that, which is an awesome story. And then Facebook happened, and so I did the same thing. I transferred all my photos there, and then every time I took new photos, I put them up, and people connected with them. And so it was largely through that community that I was able to find people.
Yep.
But also, importantly, I was asked to do an exhibition of photos at Art Week at university, and then that was covered in a few publications. It was in the university magazine, and one of the original residents of the batch got in touch with me through the editor of that magazine.
Oh, wow.
And so I caught up with him, and he put me on to Fergus, who sent me a letter. I wrote Fergus a letter, and Fergus wrote me back and sent me a piece of that letterhead. So a lot of it was, some of it was serendipitous. Some of it was through Facebook. A lot of it was through having good media coverage as well. Yeah. So I was really fortunate that it was something that the local media and at times national media have been quite interested in, and then that would often prompt people to get in contact.
Yeah.
And I've just had to have, because, you can't go to you can now because, the book's out, but there hadn't been anything done on anything like this before. So it was reading memoirs and looking at bibliographies and reading through indexes and of books and, to actually find that primary or secondary material. But in terms of the people, it was definitely with the help of, media coverage and Facebook and, so using those new technologies. And as a librarian, learning to use those new technologies this was a great project for me to try testing all of these things out on. Yeah.
So do you think had things like Facebook and that sort of stuff not eventuated or eventuated later than they had, do you think that this project and the book itself would have been quite as possible as it perhaps did end up being?
Well, I think it would have been very difficult. I mean, it would have relied a lot more on print media, like maybe having something in, the university magazine or newsletters or that sort of thing. But you wouldn't get that sort of free flow of information, that ease of contacting people that you can through social media.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think it's a lot easier for this kind of project as well. It's, again, it's something that people have fond memories of and I think would be readily willing to kind of engage with. So that's quite good as well, is that people, I'm sure, are quite willing to offer up that sort of information, particularly if it's a really dumb story and they're 30 years removed.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah.
That probably helps.
Yeah.
So one of the kind of interesting things kind of in the last 10, 15-ish years is that the university has been buying up flats themselves. The actual University of Otago has been purchasing flats and renting them out to students, basically making the university the landlord. So do you think that has changed how flatting and naming flats and flat culture has changed, or has that changed that sort of aspect of student culture?
Yeah. Look, I'm not sure about exactly, what their property holdings are. I know that the university does own some flats. I know are you thinking about the uni flats?
Particularly uni flats is what I had in mind.
Yeah. So they don't own all of those. They manage, I know that there's a significant number of them that they manage on behalf of landlords.
I see.
Yeah, but I have noticed anecdotally that flats with a uni flat sticker on them don't tend to have a named flat sign.
Yeah.
And I don't know what the situation is now, but back when I was doing my research before the book was published, I talked with whoever was the director then, and they said they didn't have an explicit policy that flats couldn't have a name. But I remember him saying that the majority of students that were renting those flats tended to be, at that time, and again, this is pre-COVID, so the world has changed since then, they tended to be international students, and so they were here for a short period of time. They were possibly moving in different circles. They maybe weren't, sort of as embedded in the student culture as those students who do name their flats. So there's some interesting limitations on, and theories about why or why not uni flats wouldn't have a name. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting.
But that is definitely something that I have noticed over the years, that where there are uni flat stickers, there's no name sign.
Yeah. And definitely, in anecdotal experience, is I found as well, they tend to be tamer flats compared to some other, just even not named flats, they tend to be a bit tamer. And I wonder if that's just because, and part of that being, if international students are more, tend to be the ones in there. I wonder if it's the draw of that stability of knowing the university is in control of this flat.
Could be.
There's not going to be any funny business kind of going on here, sort of thing.
Could be.
Which is appealing to probably international students and a certain type of local student, whereas a named flat obviously appeals to an entirely different type of student.
Well, yeah, definitely in some cases, yeah.
So one other thing I did want to talk about was, I guess, your flat that you mentioned was Mouse House. Just, I guess, talking about a bit about your how it got its name for starters, but I think that might be rather obvious.
Yeah.
And I guess, what was your experience like in that flat?
Yeah, well, it's Mouse House is it's still there. There are 4 flats. It's a terrace of 2-story weatherboard houses on the corner of House Street and Cumberland Street. I don't know the exact date it was built, but it would be sort of late 19th, early 20th century. And we inherited the sign and the name, and I remember we all thought it was a bit naff, and the sign was really crappy.
Yeah.
And we didn't really want to put it up until we started finding all these mice, and then it all made sense. And I added to the sign. So initially it was just this piece of, that nasty wheat bixie chipboardy stuff.
Yeah, MDF.
Is that? Yeah.
Yeah.
I think maybe even worse than MDF. It was like
Right.
really, really nasty. Like you put water on it and it turns into wheat bix.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it was that, and it just had Mouse House spray painted on it. And I drew a little mouse cartoon on it, and then every time we killed a mouse, I'd sort of chalk up the deaths.
Got another one.
Yeah. And we found mice in all kinds of places. It was awful. And I mean, this was my first flatting experience. My friend who I came down to Dunedin with ended up only lasting 2 weeks and went back to Christchurch. And so I ended up flatting with 3 guys, and I was the youngest I was a first year, and the next youngest after me was a third year. And so I was quite out of my depth.
Yeah.
They were really nice guys, and we all got on really well. But, I couldn't go to the pub because the drinking age hadn't changed at that point. And, and it was a very different time to what students experience now. It cost money to make a call home to Christchurch. There were no cell phones. And, I didn't know anybody here. I spent $5 a week on stamps when my rent cost $50 a week. And I'd write letters. And my friends and family would write letters back to me. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's something that, I guess, even for me, is not really something that is kind of considered now, is that prior to the advent of, cell phones and the internet and that sort of stuff, university life in general was quite starkly different and required a lot more, I guess, effort and manual labour.
Yeah.
Put it that way.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of admin. Yeah, and no computers. I don't think that there were even any. I mean, there might have been computers in labs and things like that, but there weren't banks of computers for students to use.
Yeah. Not every student had a laptop like they do now.
Well, no one had a. Yeah, most people wouldn't have even had a PC.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe an electric typewriter.
Yeah.
So, I was writing all my essays by hand, and everything was very analog.
Most of the names that we've actually mentioned so far have been rather tame. Probably the worst one was the Shit Show Chateau, but there's actually a lot of worse ones, and particularly that are quite sexual in nature. Some that I've got here, which are notable examples, which is the Cock and Swallow, Half Dozen Muff, McTitties, the Brothel, the Muff Inn, the Slut Box, Thirsty Boys, and my personal favourite, which is the Greasy Beaver Lodge, because I used to live a few doors down. So has there been any pushback against flat names? Because in particular for Greasy Beaver, it was extremely prominent. It was very obvious on the street.
It was. It was. Yes, and for your listeners who aren't familiar with Dunedin, it was on the corner of a sort of a residential street which intersects with State Highway 1 heading north. So everyone heading north out of Dunedin would drive past this house. And it was sort of a arts and craftsy bungalow style house with a porch out the front, which had an arch, and in the arch was inset this sign with the Greasy Beaver Lodge. in
In
big
very bold text.
black letters.
Very clear, very easy to read.
Very clear, very easy to read from a distance.
Yep.
Yeah. The short answer is yes, there has been some pushback at times over certain flats that I've heard of, and there may well be more that I haven't heard of. I know when I worked at the medical school, one of my colleagues used to work in a university building beside the Greasy Beaver, and he told me that one of his colleagues found it very, very upsetting, this name. So some people, and this is one of the interesting things about the names, is, they are, a lot of them have the intention of being humorous, and many of them have a double or triple entendre in there. And when you think about the demographic of people that are creating these, they're young people who have loads of in-jokes and, they're wanting to have a good time, and that doesn't mean that some of these are not going to be, clearly upsetting or triggering for some people. I'm just thinking about some of the ones that sound like the Cock and Swallow. That is a good example of a flat that was picking up on something that had happened in society at the time, which was the change in drinking age. And there were a whole bunch of contemporaneous flats that came out with pub-themed names. So that one is drawing on the tradition of Old English pubs that have, like the Stag and Pheasant, for example. Yeah. That kind of thing. Yeah. So that's sort of the underlying part of the name. Obviously, Cock and Swallow has got other connotations.
Very, yeah. Very rude.
Yes. But then, you look at the image of the sign, and it's got a swallow on it, and it's got a rooster on it.
Yeah.
And so, of course you can explain this away.
Yeah. It's enough.
But we all know.
It's just animals, so it's just...
Yeah. So there's often double or triple meanings in there around those names. Yeah.
And so have you seen I guess with flats that are kind of being named kind of now, do you see a kind of change in attitudes of kind of what they're naming? Do you see less of these more I guess sexually charged ones, given that there's things like the Me Too movement and that sort of thing? Do you think that's changed how people view and want to name their flats?
Well, I think there's maybe more blowback against things like that. Yeah. And there was one recently which, to be honest, because I'm not really in the zeitgeist anymore, being older than, current students, I had to look up Urban Dictionary to figure out what was going on there. It's very helpful.
Yeah.
And illuminating. Yes, I mean, one where the name was challenged by the contemporaries of those students as bird watchers.
Yep.
And there's that one's mentioned in the book.
Yep.
But that happened at a time where there were some verbal and physical things that had been reported around campus that were of concern to people, and bird watchers was kind of insidious. Yeah. And I mean, I'm pretty open-minded, and most of these I find quite funny. Keeping in mind that, meanwhile knowing that other people may find some of them offensive or question them, I approach this project as someone who's recording things. Yeah. Not defending or glorifying them. But I distinctly remember first seeing bird watchers, seeing the sign, and thinking that is going to upset people.
Yeah, it definitely, a lot of these straddle quite a fine line.
They do.
And I think most flats probably straddle that enough that it's not, again with Cock and Swallow, it probably straddles that line enough that it doesn't step over it.
Yeah.
Whereas bird watchers probably quite clearly steps over it and is a bit more, as you say, a bit more insidious than most of these other ones. Yeah.
That was interesting though, because I mean, you think, bird watchers, okay, How could that be offensive? But there's a number of things to take into consideration. There was the way the sign was made. There was where the sign was located. It was on a 2-story house directly overlooking the university library and its big glass windows where students would sit and be looking directly out at this flat. And the sign had, in the bowls of the B, it had eyes.
Yeah.
And so it just looked kind of creepy and threatening.
Yeah.
And people wrote about it in Critic.
Yeah.
And I guess this is interesting too. There was a back and forth in Critic over a number of weeks between the residents and between the person that was objecting. Yeah. So, good to see the discourse.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Because I think generally people go, oh, it's just students, they're just being silly. But it's like, well, if people feel that they can put that sign, albeit on a private property, but viewable from a public space, there's something that's, encroaching on people's sense of, being able to be in the environment and feel okay. It's good to be able to debate these things.
Yeah, definitely. The only thing I'll say on that is the Critic, for those who don't know, is the university or the student magazine. So do you think there's any particular reason that students gravitate towards not just sexual names for their flats, but just sometimes vulgar names in general?
Look, honestly, I think a lot of it is just trying to be funny or get a reaction. Yeah. I would like to qualify, however, because I have analysed all the names and I've got over 700 in my collection.
Wow.
And have sort of classified them according to theme, where I've been able to, which is the majority of them. And the greatest proportion of named flats actually speak to their environment.
Okay.
So they talk about the state of the flat or the immediate sort of environment. So it might be a flat called the Hedge because it's got a big hedge, or it might be a flat called the Jungle. And this is a name that turns up quite a lot because, it's in a very jungly garden, or it might be called the Palace because it's a real shithole. Yeah. So you've got a lot of names that they speak to the environment, but they've got an element of humour or irony or double entendre. So that is the majority. Second, not sex. Okay. Popular culture.
Interesting.
Yeah. So films, literature, sport, history, all kinds of, references, even wrestling, gaming. And then sex, drugs. Not so much drugs, actually. Mostly sex and alcohol. Yeah. Sex and alcohol. Yeah. But it is not the majority. I think my theory is they're the ones that stick in our minds because they're shocking, It's what we remember. Yeah. Yeah. And like Scott Eady, who he's a lecturer in sculpture at the Polytech here. He is a Francis Hodgkins Fellow, which is a very prestigious fellowship at the university. He had a fellowship in Dunedin in 2002. And when he arrived, he saw all these rude signs and was completely freaked out and blown away and thought, how did the population of Dunedin put up with this? This is outrageous and funny. And he ended up devoting his entire fellowship to creating reproductions of those signs. Yeah. Yeah, including the greasy beaver.
Yes, I believe there's a picture of that in the book, which I thought was very good.
yeah, and that piece. So it's a massive fiberglass beaver with a. He made a massive fiberglass beaver made with a big sign with a greasy beaver lodge on it, and that's part of the Hocken collection. Yeah. Hocken collections, yeah. So and that's something that's really interested me too about named flats is how they inspire other artists or creatives.
Amazing. It's really interesting, that most of them are not rude ones. That's not something I would have expected. As you say, I think it's ones that stick in our mind the most because they're the ones you're most shocked by, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it surprised me too.
So how kind of ingrained are these names in student society? So do they tend to stick around for a long time? Do they, as you say, the kind of half-life, if you will, of a student is about 3 years. Do they tend to stick around longer than that, or do they tend to chop and change quite a lot?
A lot of them do stick around, and some are very ephemeral. So, for example, Footrot Flats on Clyde Street has been there since 1975.
Yep.
It's still there. It's very faint now, and the building's actually owned by Arana Hall.
Yep.
The other one, the one that's probably the most famous, is Pink Flat the Door, which is down on Clyde Street as well, down the other end. It's been there since 1988. There's one up on, actually, I can't remember the name of the street. It's up on the hill. It's called the Lighthouse. And my mother-in-law, who's in her 80s, remembers it from when she was at Teachers College.
Oh, right.
Yeah. And, so there are quite a few around. I mean, there's some that have been around for, over 10 years as well. Yeah, so it's not just those really long-lived ones. I'm thinking about the Jolly Roger on Great King Street.
Yep.
Do you remember that one?
I do. Again, that's across the road from Greasy Beaver Lodge, so I used to walk past it all the time. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's flanked by 2 other named flats at the moment. As well as all 3 of them have got a name for the first time in a long time. Yeah.
Neat.
Yeah. So there are quite a few. Yeah. And like the ones on Clyde Street, so there was Moe's. Moe's was there for a really long time.
Yeah.
But the sign ended up, I remember I was in touch with a student who had just signed the flat. She was really excited to be living in Moe's. And she got in touch and said, oh, look, I'm really bummed out. The sign's been nicked and it just keeps being stolen. And so we're not going to bother putting it back up. And it's been without its name ever since. But I understand too, like the whole red card system is, I know it's been around for a while now. As far as I was aware, it didn't happen when I was a student. But I know that nicking signs can sometimes be part of that sort of whole thing.
But from what I understand, if I remember rightly in the book, Moe's is still colloquially known as Moe's. It's just not got the sign anymore.
It doesn't have the sign. Yeah. Well, I haven't been in touch with the students that are living there, currently, recently. So, yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah. But, yeah, there used to be a whole row. Yeah, there was, the Hilton is still there, the Hilton on Clyde.
Yep.
There was Tui and Sifter Rosa and Route 69 and, there's a whole bunch of them.
Yeah, and there was, even again from when I went down in August, there was a lot that was still there from when that I remembered as well. Which was kind of nice to see, I guess. Nice to know that they just weren't ripped down by either the landlords or the tenants or nicked from another flat or something like that. It was nice to kind of see that. Even though some do get stolen, there seems to be some sort of, I guess, respect of signs in a way. And I guess there's a weird kind of honor among thieves kind of attitude towards them in a lot of ways.
So. Yeah, I think so. And I think too, students want to live somewhere that's got a story. It's part of living in a character house. This is another layer of that is, living somewhere that has got a student history. And I know of, some flats where, I mean, apparently, some of these flats are collecting more rent. I know of one that, there was some trouble. There was a bit of a bidding war, which isn't great because we don't want people, inflating the market unnecessarily where rents are already so expensive.
Yeah.
But yeah, I have heard of that happening.
Unfortunately, just with the realities of everything that's going on at the moment is sad but not unusual is probably what I'd say. So going on to, I guess, the actual signs themselves, kind of what goes into their make, I guess, how they tend to be made, and do we see any, I guess, pushback, particularly from landlords, as to whether the quality's any good or not?
There have been some landlords that have talked with their students about the signs. Like there was a student years ago. He's no longer a student anymore, but he set up a little business making signs where he would make them to the student's design with input from the landlord.
Yep,
so it was kind of cool. A lot of his signs got stolen because they were so good.
Was that that was the guy from Pick's flat?
Jasper.
Well, funny story again.
You don't know him, do you?
All 3 of those guys, I went to Arana with them.
No way.
So when I saw that picture, I was like,
funny.
I know those guys.
That's classic. Oh, that's so Dunedin. Yeah,
Yeah, it was a bit like, oh, Dunedin, or even just New Zealand, very
yeah,
small.
yeah, for sure.
So yeah,
Yeah,
so his signs were, I guess, quite a lot more professional than perhaps some others that had been made.
yeah. There are some landlords too. One in particular that I can think of who has just taken the initiative and created signs and put them on their flats,
Mm.
which is interesting. And I don't know if that's made them more successful in getting tenants. It's kind of interesting. It's sort of appropriating the student culture.
Yeah, so is this signs that landlords, they've kind of named the flat themselves rather
Mm,
than
yeah,
I guess
rather than,
taking the name it already has and just being like, I'll just make a sign for it. They've gone
yeah,
and
yeah,
named
yeah.
it themselves.
Yes,
Mm.
yes. And, quite generic looking signs.
Yeah.
So, it kind of loses that. You can tell immediately, well, at least I can, but maybe that's because, I'm used to
Yeah.
looking at these things.
Yeah.
It's very apparent to me that it's not a student creation.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
see.
But in terms of materials, this is something that has always fascinated me too, and it has changed over time. So, all kinds of bewildering array of materials used to create signs, from headboards of single beds, which used to be a lot more available than they
Mm.
are now, because we used to have a lot of secondhand dealers in Dunedin that students would buy their furniture from.
Hmm.
And yeah, bed heads, surfboards,
Mm.
skateboards, whiteboards, bits of wood,
Yeah.
broken down beer crates,
Classic.
yeah, beer boxes, cupboard doors,
Yep.
actual doors,
Yep.
sometimes stolen, reinterpreted road signs.
Hmm.
We've seen a few of those.
Yeah.
Yeah. So all kinds of interesting materials have been used.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just kind of whatever students can get kind of their hands on, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And, certainly, I mean, more people have cars
Mm.
now, but, limited access to resources, or being able to, get to the hardware shop to buy materials, just means you might do with what
Yeah.
you've got.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Where that might be, a vivid on a bit of cardboard, or it might be a bit of insulation tape, adding some extra letters to a road sign, or yeah.
There was something I found really interesting, was just all the weird things that people kind of cobble together almost.
Yeah, that's right. Oh, yeah, spray painted on a couch
Yep.
outside the
Yep.
flat.
Yeah, very classic as well. So a lot of the flats, something that I found really interesting was that a lot of the flats were built in the late 19th and early 20th century. There's not been a huge amount of ones that have been built sort of more recently than that, really, which I think is actually probably not unique to Dunedin in that regard, in terms of the rest of the country. And primarily, they haven't had a huge amount of renovation since then. And so now we've got, of course, this healthy home standard is coming into effect soonish, if it hasn't already. And do you think that will change flatting in general and how named flats are named? Because, of course, a lot of these flats are named for the fact that they're cold, and that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Do you think that's going to have an effect, not just in the general effect of obviously people are going to have a better flat, but just the culture and that sort of thing?
Yeah, well, it might do. Yeah, it could do. It's hard to say. Certainly the types of names that evoke the environment of the place may change, for sure. Yeah, might not get any more castle or crap shacks, or or kelp fish, or the palace. We might not. Yeah, we might not have so many of those, but that wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. In terms of new builds, I mean, there are some streets where I'm noticing that the old places are definitely going. Grange Street, Hyde Street, a lot of those old workers' cottages are disappearing, and also between, say, Cumberland and Castle Street, over the years, there's definitely been sort of infill housing going on in back sections and that kind of thing too. And I think, with the government's recent opening up of regulations, that we may see more of that infill housing. Yeah. But hopefully people will treasure the, late 19th century and early 20th century housing stock, because that does give us a real feeling for a place. Yeah.
Yeah, it's something that struck me, I guess, that again when I went back in August, that I hadn't expected was, having lived in Wellington now for about 3 years, is the vibe that Dunedin gives just from its architecture, and the flats and just the even larger buildings as well. It has a vibe and a particular feeling when you're walking around that isn't quite the same compared to other other cities in the South Island. It's just, it's got its own sort of thing going on. Yeah,
definitely. Yeah, and there's really good environmental considerations for thinking about that as well. Yeah,
definitely.
Don't want to be chucking all that stuff in landfill.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And so kind of, again, in a similar vein, how do you see kind of flat culture and naming flats changing going forward, particularly because the university has taken, this is a bit more longer term, but in the last sort of 20 or 30 years, it's taken a much harder stance on alcohol, and couch burning is the one that people usually turn to. And, it's brought up pubs as well, turn them into study spaces, the big one being Gardy's down by the Botanic Gardens. My mum was very disappointed when she learned that had shut down when I went to uni. So how do you, in light of those things, how do you see kind of flat naming and flatting culture changing going forward?
Yeah, well, I think, and again, this is anecdotally, but also, actually, I think the statistics are showing that young people are drinking less than their predecessors. And that's a good thing for everyone's health.
Yep.
Mental health, physical health, long-term health. The cost of living is so high. I mean, I've heard of some people paying 70% of their income on their rent, which is insane. So people can't actually afford to piss up a lot.
Yep.
So there could be a number of drivers there. I think people are more health conscious. Young people are more health conscious too than their predecessors. The thing that does concern me is where houses are being turned into studio flats. And I know that for some people that's going to suit them living in a studio flat, but it does worry me with our mental health statistics and our terrible suicide rate, that and particularly when we're in a pandemic situation, you end up with a lot of young people living alone and being unsupported. And so that concerns me. And of course, as a byproduct of that sort of thing is going to mean that those people aren't going to be the people that are naming flats. I see that very much as a output of a strong household, a strong community and friendships and that sort of thing. And the university or polytech lifestyle is more than just getting an education. It's about growing yourself as a person and having good home life experiences with flatmates. I think is just as important as what you come out, the ticket that you come out with at the other end.
Certainly. No, it's there's one thing that I've always told people, when younger people ask me, should I go to university? It's kind of like, it's not necessarily about the piece of paper you get at the end. People that I met at university, I still have around weekly to play Dungeons and Dragons with, and that's I haven't been at uni. I haven't lived in Dunedin for nearly 10 years now. So, that's, it's those other aspects as well that you get, those other experiences, those other people that you meet. That is really the meat of it, I guess. I mean, at this point, I couldn't care less about the very expensive piece of paper that I've got on my wall. It's more about the people that you meet and those experiences that you have. So it's definitely more about that and that sort of thing. So I guess to kind of round it out, something I always ask people that I interview, because it always generates very interesting stories, is what has been your favorite aspect of researching this topic? Or is there a particular story from your research that particularly stands out to you? I know we kind of talked that a little bit before, but yeah, more broadly, is there anything that that sticks out to you as your favorite?
Oh, look, I have just loved the process, really. I've loved the process of hunting and finding and detecting. And I'm just super, super privileged that that's actually my job now as well. But I think one of the most memorable things about doing the book was how much it meant to people. And some of them were just incredibly touched and grateful to have their story told. And I think that's one of the things that's really stayed with me and will continue to stay with me. Yeah, that I'm really, really proud of having done this. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, no, as I said, it's one of my favorite books in my collection, if not the favorite now.
Oh, wow. Thanks, Thomas. That really means a lot.
It is. Yeah, I think it's fantastic. So I highly recommend anyone listening, if you are interested in this particular subject, or just Dunedin, you went to Dunedin for uni or anything like that, I cannot recommend this book highly enough. It is, just absolutely phenomenal, full of some really good stories. Even if you didn't go to Otago, it's full of some really funny and kind of interesting stories. So I got mine from Mighty Ape, but I know that there's other places as well that you can purchase it from. So if you are interested, it's
Look, you can get it directly from me, actually, and I will sign it and write a message in it, and it will have a Dunedin City of Literature sticker on it, and so people can get directly in touch with me if they want to buy a copy.
Awesome. That's a great segue into the last question. If people want to find you and know more about and see more of what you're doing, how do they find you?
Okay, well, I'm on Facebook at DN Flat Names, and also Instagram, and the website is dunedinflatnames.co.nz.
Cool. Awesome. With that, again, thank you very much for coming on and talking to me about flats and students and all that sort of stuff. It's always really nice to talk to people who know a lot more than me about what you've discovered and that sort of stuff, and also share it with all the listeners as well, who I'm sure appreciate having your expertise and knowledge brought onto the show.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks so much for the invite, Thomas. It's been awesome fun.
Thank you again to Sarah for coming on and talking to me all about flats and student flatting culture in Dunedin. It's something that is quite nostalgic and close to my heart, so I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. As we mentioned, if you would like to purchase Sarah's book, Scarfie Flats of Dunedin, you can purchase online or from good bookstores in Aotearoa, or you can contact Sarah directly on Facebook if you'd like it signed by her. I know I've said it a few times, but I'll say it again. I absolutely adore this book. Even if you aren't connected to Dunedin or its student culture, there is some great stories in there for everyone to enjoy. If you want to send me feedback, ask a question, suggest a topic, or just have a chinwag, you can find my email and social media on historyaotearoa.com. Aotearoa spelt Aotearoa. You can also find helpful resources there, like transcripts, sources, and translations for some of the te reo Māori we have used. You can help support Hans through Patreon, buying merch, or giving us a review. It means a lot and helps spread the story of Aotearoa, New Zealand. As always, haere tū atu, hoki tū mai. See you next time.